It's fantastic to have Jane here because she is unwell, so it's very brave of her as well. So welcome everybody to our, I think this is our fourth seminar in the Labour History Looking Ahead After 60 Years series.
Well, it's only our third, I think.
Is it our third?
Mm.
Oh, well, okay, I'm losing track. I think you're right. This, of course, series has been set up because this is our 60th year. May, I think, 1962 was the first issue of Labour History. So we're actually right on beam tonight. And the idea is, rather than looking back at past glories, we really want to showcase the kind of work that we are publishing now, the way the direction the field is going, and how studying Labour history or looking at Labour history really can illuminate all kinds of subjects and national history's new approaches. So tonight we're incredibly fortunate to have two wonderful speakers who will demonstrate that for us. Professor Jane Lydon, who's the Wesfarmers Chair of Australian History at the University of Western Australia, an incredibly well-published historian whose books include Imperial Emotions, The Politics of Empathy in the British Empire, which was published by Cambridge in 2019, and a study of the British anti-slavery movement and Australian colonisation during the 19th century, titled No Slavery in a Free Land, Anti-Slavery and Australia, 1780 to 1900. Jane is leading an ARC-funded project on writing slavery into Australian history. And our second speaker, Jeremy Martens, is part of that project. He also teaches history at the University of Western Australia and is a prize-winning author both for an article that was published in History Australia and a book on Western Australian society and government house. But he's the author of Empire and Asian Migration, Sovereignty, Immigration Restriction and Protest in British Settled Colonies, again in the 19th century. So that's the order in which they're going to speak. Jane will go first, and then we'll be followed straight away by Jeremy, and then we have time for questions. So thank you, Jane, again. It's wonderful of you to make the effort to be here tonight. I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, thank you very much. So please, somebody just speak up if you can't hear me or there are any other problems. I will actually start sharing my screen. Okay, so I'm unless anyone tells me otherwise, I'm assuming that's all clear. So before, and also I do apologise for my voice. I do have COVID, unfortunately, so it's very croaky, but I will soldier on. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional country of the Whadjuk Noongar people, so way down here in the southwest, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Today, Jeremy and I are going to talk about how we might write slavery back into Australian Labour history, drawing from our research project, Western Australian Legacies of British Slavery. So this is our website, and if you're interested, you can go and have a look at what we're doing there in more detail. We have a fantastic team. The other chief investigators, besides Jeremy and myself, include Zoe Laidlaw and Paul Arthur. And our partner investigators include Catherine Hall, Keith McClelland and Alan Lester. So we're very fortunate. We have a fantastic postdoc, Dr. Georgina Arnott, some wonderful PhD students. So there's quite a lot of work going on around these questions from the team at the moment. Okay, so in August 1833, British Parliament abolished slavery in the British Caribbean, Mauritius and the Cape. In place of slavery, the negotiated settlement established a system of apprenticeship and granted £20 million in compensation to be paid by British taxpayers to the former slave owners. However, the celebration of British abolition has overshadowed memories of the country's long prior history as the world's leading slave trading nation, Only slowly is Britain beginning to acknowledge the continuing significance of slavery and its impact. So this is a very topical debate in Britain at the moment. What we're seeing here are stamps that were issued to commemorate the end of the slave trade in 1807. And then, of course, the system of slavery was, you know, another landmark was 1833. And here we see, as I'm sure you'll immediately recognise, the statue of Edward Colston, which formerly stood in Bristol and was the focus for Black Lives Matter protests a couple of years ago. Now his statue, complete with graffiti, is on display in Bristol's Art Museum, M-Shed. And in Australia too, of course, we've had our own debates around these same questions, also inspired perhaps, you know, or reignited by the Black Lives Matter movement. And in response, our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, made this comment that there was no slavery in Australia. It was pretty brutal, but there was no slavery. And of course, this immediately sparked responses, particularly from Indigenous leaders, like Yaru leader and Labor Senator Pat Dodson, who said there were many examples of Aboriginal people who were basically incarcerated, enslaved on pastoral properties under acts which indentured them to employers without any pay. So many pointed out that the structural racism that sanctions Black deaths in custody, for example, in Australia, can be understood in part as a legacy of slavery. So these comments hint at the ways that celebrating the end of one archetypal form of unfreedom in the Caribbean simultaneously obscured and sanctioned other forms of exploitation. I'm not sure whether this is useful. These are just some of the kind of key dates that I'll be touching on, and I'll be focusing my comments around the 1820s. Although, so yeah, just to focus that. So a number of scholars have argued that the anti-slavery movement helped Britain's ruling classes maintain the British social order and manage the transformations of industrial capitalism. Slavery wealth stimulated new institutions and industries, including after abolition. And we've seen a lot of studies of what's been called the new histories of capitalism, primarily focused on America, that have sort of taken up this question in sometimes controversial ways. David Bryan Davis was one who, a scholar who early on suggested that Britain's conversion to anti-slavery ideology was related to the Industrial Revolution's need to legitimise wage labour and the bitter struggle over domestic reform. Davis examined the contradiction between elite parliamentarians' concern for the distant Caribbean slave and their oppressive maintenance of the domestic British social order, tracing, and this is Davis, he traced a complex process that drew distinctions and boundaries which opened the way under a guise of moral rectitude for unprecedented forms of oppression. So what I'm arguing that is that if we expand this, this usually triangular sort of analysis, you know, between Britain, the Caribbean and America, to consider global processes of immigration and settler colonialism, it's clear that that also applies to the history of Australia, and I believe reveals their fundamental interrelationship. Successful abolition became one of the vital underpinnings of British supremacy in the Victorian era, in tandem with other key reforms. So, for example, Catholic emancipation in 1829 and the 1832 Reform Act. Together, these campaigns offered proof of the superior quality of British freedom and made large numbers of Britons feel important, benign, and above all, patrons and possessors of liberty. I'm quoting there from Linda Colley's Forging the Nation. But the price of redrawing the boundaries of freedom was paid by those considered to be in their minority and to require protection, education, and governance, such as convicts, the poor, non-white workers, and Australian Indigenous people. During the 1820s, the abolitionist campaign entered its so-called gradualist phase. This was a compromise between the anti-slavery lobby and the West India interest, in which both sides agreed that slaves needed to be civilised and Christianised before they were freed. administrators grappled with schemes for emancipation in the Caribbean in tandem with transportation, immigration, and colonisation policy. So you can see something of this very interesting table shows numbers of convicts being transported to the penal settlements in Australia. And you'll see here that they grew and grew and grew and sort of peaked before declining at the moment of the abolition of slavery and the passing of the Act. So amid the social turmoil that followed the Napoleonic Wars and rising unrest among the working classes in Britain, this is where we see the numbers of transported convicts rising in this very sharp way. Intense popular agitation over these years aimed to reform the corrupt and exclusive political system, prompting increasingly harsher official measures. So this is a well-known story that I'm sure many in this audience in particular will be quite familiar. Official repression reached a kind of a climax, certainly a landmark, in the Peterloo massacre. At St Peter's Fields in Manchester in August 1819, a peaceful rally of nearly 60,000 people seeking parliamentary reform was violently dispersed by troops. So this is Cruikshank's print, and you see here figures like, "Oh, pray, sir, don't kill Mammy. She only came to see Mr Hunt and his Holman Hunt," the public speaker, and so on. And of course, its bicentenary was reached a couple of years ago, commemorated by this film by Mike Leigh. So radicals contrasted workers with slaves, seeking to focus attention on the plight of British workers, which they asserted was similar to or worse than that of Caribbean slaves. So here, for example, you see that conveyed very graphically in the contrast between the British anti-slavery movement's logo, the kneeling shackled slave, this is Wedgwood's famous medallion, and the words around the edge, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And here, another Cruikshank drawing actually following Peterloo, where he's satirising that idea and saying, here's a worker kneeling and saying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" with the response, "No, you are a poor weaver." So they're arguing that, in fact, British workers' rights were less than those of the enslaved Africans. So radicals like Cobbett pointed out that William Wilberforce, the leader of the anti-slavery movement, had suggested a law unionising workmen in 1799. And following Peterloo, the Combination Acts were passed in support of the repressive measures of Lord Liverpool's Tory government. And this was a kind of an argument often made against figures like Wilberforce. It was said of Wilberforce, well, you might know a lot about what's going on in the hold of the slave ship, but you don't seem to know very much about what's happening in the bottom of a coal mine in your own country. As the British anti-slavery movement legitimated the precepts of free market capitalism, it emphasised the distinction between slave and free labour, yet overlooked the harsh conditions of white European labourers and advocated the economic, legal and moral discipline of workers. And again, I hope I'm not labouring the point, so to speak, but again in this cartoon, we see John Bull looking through a telescope at the distant Caribbean, Jamaica. And the reality is that the enslaved are having a wonderful time dancing and eating, but John Bull is being misled by these distorted images of exaggerating the conditions of the enslaved. And in the meantime, in the background, the British poor go hungry and are reduced to beggardom. So an overlooked aspect of this very well-known antagonism is the way that transportation, and especially the harsh reduction of convict rights after 1820, functioned to further the conservative anti-slavery cause by subduing domestic dissent and reinforcing the class order. A key element of this dynamic was the contrast drawn by abolitionists between the potential redemption of the enslaved and the moral degradation of British convicts. They didn't deserve rights, they didn't deserve to be treated well. This was the setting for the big inquiry. The Tory ministry believed that transportation had lost its terror, and in 1819 appointed John Bigg, recently returned from 4 years as Chief Justice of Trinidad, to make it terrifying again. In Trinidad, Bigg had helped develop a model of slave protection but he considered that blacks needed discipline and that, quote unquote, slavery was a necessary evil. Through the lens of Biggs' work, we can see the close links between Caribbean emancipation and transportation over these years, as following his 1822 to 23 reports, key aspects of slave reform, as it was called, were applied to white convicts in the colonies. These included bestowing private property rights in labour through assignment, increased severity of convict punishment, restriction on the rights and opportunities of emancipists, a change in colonial land policy from encouraging small emancipist landholdings to large estates owned by wealthy capitalists, so modelled on the plantation perhaps, continuities in the legal system which established colonial magistrates in a role equivalent to the Caribbean Office of the Protector of Slaves, and fostering racialised industries and labour practices at places like Port Macquarie, which in several key respects mimicked the Caribbean slave plantation so familiar to Big. And of course, again, this, another sort of hotly contested question in Australian historiography is whether white convicts were in fact treated in the same way as enslaved Africans. And this is, so, as I say, long-standing debate that goes back to John Hirst's fabulous study of convictism, and many historians, and in fact recently dealt with by Jenny Jefferson. And historians have tended to focus on the considerable gap between official ideals, in other words, what officials wanted to make the convict regime like, and actual practice. In other words, the way that convicts were able to advocate for rights and to carve out a rich life in Australia. However, in the era before abolition, the category of slave was relatively elastic and for many contemporaries encompassed both convict and African. For example, this is just one example. The Bermuda-born Chief Justice Francis Forbes noted in 1825, I am, a West Indian, and I can truly say that the assigned convicts appear to me to be considered and treated by the generality of settlers in precisely the same way that slaves are considered and treated in the West Indies. So very happy to return to this question later, because I know people have expressed quite strong views either way. But really the point that I want to make is that from the perspective of administrators, so policymakers, and as Hamish Maxwell Stewart again notes, a key impact of Biggs' report was to prevent the convicts' route to independence, as emancipists were forced to become wage earners within a disciplined labour force rather than independent small-scale landholders. In addition, as New South Wales presented new economic possibilities for colonial investment, anti-slavery leaders, including Brougham and Wilberforce, invested in large agricultural stations, worked by convicts, sorry, slightly out of order here, such as the Australian Agricultural Company, formed in 1824. The AA Company's prominent and wealthy shareholders included many anti-slavery leaders, such as Wilberforce, William Smith, and Stephen Lushington. Theories of labour discipline were central within both reforming slavery and new colonial labour regimes. So in 1828, 1829, as debates around abolition heated up, particularly in Parliament, the problem of colonisation was taken up by Edward Gibbon Wakefield, whose anonymous sketch of a proposal for colonising Australasia was first printed in June 1829. And of course, he was in prison. He was in Newgate at the time. And he published his early works on this topic anonymously and relied on others to promote them. His own solution was to impose a sufficient, what he called a sufficient price for land, which would restrict land ownership to those with capital and force others to work for them. So this was a device or a measure to compel labour. Slavery as a foundational form of labour formed an integral thread throughout his influential texts, published over the following few years. And of course, and I've argued elsewhere about Wakefield's direct engagement with slavery debates, actually, and I will come back to this in a minute, but just want to note that in the debate, so this is Hansard, and of course, all of us can just can access this online and follow those debates, particularly in May 1833, just before the Anti-Slavery Act the Abolition Act was finally passed. And you'll see that Wakefield's scheme was a kind of touchstone for these debates, because of course people on both sides of the debate were very much concerned with how to compel labour. Will the sugar colonies, the slave colonies become? Will we lose profits? Will they become defunct if we pass this measure? And so they were casting about for these answers. So Wakefield's principles were invoked to show that free labour would not work unless coercive mechanisms such as restricting land were applied. So he had a number of critics who at the time pointed out this connection between Wakefield's proposals and the aspects of it that reproduced slavery. So, for example, John Crawford, the well-known Orientalist and expert on Asian colonies, said, he proposes to recreate this distinction on the model which exists in slave colonies, and so on and so forth. So he was called out by his critics for simply perpetuating this system that they were trying to abolish. However, Wakefield's adherents, so what one critic termed Mr. Wakefield's speaking trumpets, became advocates for settler colonialism in places such as South Australia. In the Caribbean too, especially in the southern so-called new colonies such as Trinidad and Demerara, where there was extensive uncleared land, settler colonialism was applied as a means to compel freed slaves to work. So after abolition, during the so-called apprenticeship period and beyond, people like William Burnley, the biggest slave owner in Trinidad, insisted that the only way to ensure profits after abolition was to introduce systematic colonisation and its principles. He gave evidence to an inquiry into wastelands in 1836, and he said, we'll be ruined unless Wakefield's plan is carried into execution. Okay, so in conclusion, recent research, again sometimes termed new histories of capitalism, as well as a renewed interest in racial capitalism, suggests that where traditional Marxist accounts located slavery as a kind of prior stage to capitalism, in fact it persisted after capitalism emerged and after abolition in 1833, complementing wage labour and other forms of unfree labour such as indenture. And of course, we've seen in recent years a tremendous focus on settler colonial studies, which has, its mantra is, the elimination of the native. So I think that has tended to displace attention from Indigenous labour and in fact labour itself as a category. But in Western Australia, Indigenous labour was essential to colonial society from the earliest period. And Jeremy, who I'm about to pass over to, will discuss that further. In Western Australia, for example, the Northwestern pastoralist and pearling industries relied heavily on Aboriginal labour, incorporating workers into capitalism, yet allowing the maintenance of traditional kinship, economic and social systems. We can also see the application of means of punishment and discipline derived from the Caribbean to Aboriginal people as a means of regulating and ensuring this labour. That is, the persistence of slavery alongside other forms of coercive labour. So I'll stop there and hand over. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jane, and hello, everybody. Can you all hear me? Good. Okay, I'll share my screen and hopefully it'll come through. All right, so as I said, thank you very much. Before I start, I'm going to continue from where Jane left off and talk about forced labour and apprenticeship in WA's pastoral industry between 1840 and 1850. But before I do so, I'd just like to acknowledge that the Crawley campus of UWA acknowledges that it's situated on Wajak Noongar land and that the Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs and knowledge. Okay, so this special meeting held in 1847, in June of 1847, the York Agricultural Society, and I'm focusing mostly on the York district of Western Australia, which is at the top of this map, just to the east of Perth there. At this meeting, the members proposed and carried a series of resolutions relating to, quote, the ruinous scarcity of labour in the colony. Several of these resolutions touched on the need for forced labour and included a call to establish a penal settlement in Western Australia, which the Society had been lobbying for since 1845. Chairing the meeting was Thomas Carter, who owned a substantial 2,250 acre land grant at Northern, which is at the heart of the Avon Valley. Carter opened the meeting by emphasizing the many and serious evils arising from the present unprecedented scarcity of labour. There were farms, he said, without a single labouring man on them, including, quote, a respectable settler near me who could not get a man at any price, and who not only himself and his son, but even his daughter were obliged to go out into the bush shepherding, and had not yet a rod of ground ploughed. Several other gentlemen bore evidence to the deplorable state of downright slavery to which they were reduced, and what made it still worse, after toiling from before day till after dark, they could not accomplish all that ought to have been done, end quote. The meeting thus loudly and almost universally called for the introduction of convict labour, and even men who once had been violently opposed, quote, now were the most strenuous advocates for them as the only thing to save the colony. For 20 years following the establishment of the Swan River colony in 1829, Western Australia's settler elite had warned of the polluting example derived from convict servitude. However, beginning in the mid-1840s, public pressure built up to tackle economic stagnation, a persistent labour shortage, and low immigration levels through some form of transportation from Britain. In fact, a step in this direction had already been taken in 1842 with the British government's decision to send juvenile offenders from Parkhurst Prison to the colony. The Parkhurst scheme, along with several attempts through the 1830s and 1840s to recruit indentured labourers from India and China, undercut the claim that Western Australia was committed to the principle of free labour. Indeed, as Kelly Moss argues, the settlement of Swan River was predicated on the use of coerced labourers from the start. Even so, these various initiatives were unable to meet the need for a more expansive solution to the labour problem, and increasing numbers of settlers, led by pastoralists from the Avon Valley district east of Perth, mounted a challenge to transport British convicts to Western Australia. The Avon pastoralists were represented by a powerful lobby group, the York Agricultural Society, which floated several proposals to alleviate the colony's labour shortage, and organised a series of influential petitions supporting transportation from 1845. Pastoralists' push for convict labour should be viewed in the context of the violent dispossession of Balladong Noongar country that took place between 1831 and 1839, for the state-sanctioned taking of Balladong country enabled the establishment of a highly profitable pastoral industry, which in the 1840s became a major source of colonial export income. Once the colonists succeeded in wresting territorial control of the Avon, they made a concerted effort to recruit Balladong and other Noongar workers to labour on pastoral stations throughout the valley. This effort bore some fruit. As early as 1841, Advocate General George Fletcher Moore emphasised the importance of Aboriginal people's labour in the colony's pastoral districts, noting that if it were to be withdrawn, quote, the want of their assistance would be seriously felt. The pastoral industry's profitability depended upon a reliable and affordable supply of workers, both settler and Indigenous. However, once this supply faltered by the mid-1840s, the pressure for forced labour began to build. Given the crucial role Avon pastoralists played in the introduction of convict transportation to Western Australia, it is remarkable that little research has been conducted on the early history of pastoralism in the colony or on the historical factors that placed Avon pastoralists at the vanguard of the agitation for convict labour. What my research shows is that coercive labour practices were well established in the Avon Valley by the mid-1840s, and that the York Agricultural Society's lobbying for convict labour reflected a desire to intensify already existing patterns of unfree labour rather than a brand new intervention. Strict control of labour had been the intention of propertied colonists from the beginning of the settlement of Swan River in 1829. Many wealthy settlers brought indentured servants with them. These were bonded to their masters and obliged to labour for the duration of their contracts in return for board, lodging, or in some cases, wages. All indentured labourers over the age of 10 were considered investment capital, which entitled the master to land in the new colony. Thus, the greater the number of servants bound to a settler, the larger the land grant they received. However, elite colonists' efforts to create a hierarchical social order and enforce labour discipline in the colony were undermined almost immediately. Significant economic challenges, including the slow allocation of land grants and a shortage of money, forced several settlers to discharge their servants. Other servants challenged their poor working and living conditions and were able to obtain improvements to their conditions of indenture. While in many cases servants remained beholden to their masters, by the time the Avon Valley had been conquered and pastoral stations and farms established in the 1830s, many landowners were struggling to employ sufficient numbers of workers. As one correspondent noted of the Avon Valley in 1839, there was, quote, a great dearth of labour, with farmers being compelled to mow their wheat and other grain at considerable loss. Pastoralists were also required to pay exorbitant wages, with the average during shearing season as much as 12 shillings a day. By the early 1840s, Noongar labourers had become indispensable as shepherds or as seasonal harvest time workers. George Fletcher Moore recognised in 1841 that Indigenous workers had become, quote, a valuable help in the present dearth of labour, and if their services were suddenly withdrawn, the want of their assistance would be seriously felt in a variety of ways. The York Agricultural Society in 1842 went so far as to state that Indigenous workers had, quote, been of essential service to the farmer in carrying on his various operations. Even so, settler employers faced significant difficulties in recruiting and maintaining a tractable, dependent Indigenous workforce. The colonial government had intended to augment the colony's labour supply by instituting a bounty scheme in 1841, whereby settlers would be rewarded for recruiting, training, and retaining Noongar workers. However, the scheme failed, and when it was abandoned in 1848, only 10 settlers had qualified for the reward. Given the enormous demand for both Indigenous and white workers, it is perhaps unsurprising that Avon pastoralists and their allies would consider forced labour to be a potential solution. As early as 1837, there were suggestions that authorities should, quote, try the experiment of working the unruly natives on the roads or in forming other improvements. If those men, quote, confined in the Fremantle jail for attacks on settlers at York are convicted, a good opportunity will present itself to make the attempt. The natives convicted of theft or other aggressions, if the plan and agitation is brought to bear, will be chained to a wheelbarrow and will be compelled to perform so much work as their strength will enable them, end quote. In the mid-1840s, acting protector Thomas Ewell wrote approvingly that Indigenous men in the Avon Valley who had, quote, undergone a period of punishment on the island of Rottnest have become expert as reaping and other agricultural labours. And in 1848, the colony's Executive Council approved the transfer of 20 prisoners from Martens prison to the mainland to work on public works projects around the colony. At much the same time, another scheme was trialled, whereby Indigenous prisoners who had served a portion of their sentences were allowed to, quote, enter the employment of settlers in the neighborhood of their own localities. In spite of these efforts at coercion, the number of Indigenous workers on Avon farms, stations, and roads was never sufficient to meet the voracious demand. As much as settlers tried to cajole and coerce Lydon men, women, and children into employment, these communities in the 1840s retained enough independence to resist the pressure. Pastoralists and farmers in the Avon Valley thus turned instead to a different source of cheap, tractable labour: juvenile offenders from Parkhurst Prison, who from 1842 were sent out to Western Australia as indentured servants. Of the first 18 boys arriving in Western Australia in 1842, 6 were indentured as farm lads, and many subsequent Parkhurst immigrants were to augment the Avon Valley labour force. So much so that a report in 1848 noted that, quote, Parkhurst boys had led the van of operations amongst the farmers in the Avon. I might almost say that by this labour alone, farms have been kept from total ruin, end quote. Even so, there were concerns about the cost of this labour. At a meeting of the York Agricultural Society held in 1845, the guardian of juvenile immigrants, Scholes, was asked about a, quote, wished-for reduction in the wages paid to these boys. He responded that both he and the governor were inclined to meet the wishes of the masters in this respect, but that the British authorities would have to be consulted first. In the meantime, he had, quote, adopted a means of payment in kind, whereby the boys could be paid the amount of their wages in stock. He thought this would be a relief to masters. However, as beneficial as the Parkhurst indenture scheme had been, owing to an almost total absence of competent labour, farmers and pastoralists were compelled to employ these boys in business for which they were sometimes found not at all to be suited. That's a quote. There were also calls to reform the colony's masters and servants legislation. It was pointed out that if an indentured servant should prove incorrigibly idle and refuse to work, the only redress the master possessed was to send the offender to jail for 3 months, at the termination of which time he is free and the employer had lost the assistance on which he depended. The enforcement of labour discipline was also at times controversial. As early as 1842, for example, the Enquirer, a newspaper, complained that Parkhurst apprentices were subject to summary corporal punishment, but that colonial magistrates were prevented from sentencing Indigenous workers to the same penalty. While in the 1840s there were legal prohibitions on magistrates imposing corporal punishment on Indigenous people convicted of breaking the law, the extrajudicial flogging of Noongar workers by Avon pastoralists was commonplace. Furthermore, draconian masters and servants legislation was frequently used to punish both settler and Aboriginal apprentices. To conclude, after 1845, Avon Valley landowners made increasingly strident calls to implement a regime of unfree labour, first petitioning for Pentonville prisoners and later for an extensive convict transportation system funded by the British government. As one York pastoralist complained in 1849, the capital of landowners had been, quote, utterly swamped, eaten up by the high rates that had been paid to the labouring population. While he would not, under ordinary circumstances, for one moment give the preference to convict labour, there were extraordinary circumstances that render free labour at the present time objectionable, and if not objectionable, not to be obtained, end quote. The shortage of workers was not simply economically damaging to land-owning colonists, for were, quote, labour very cheap and to be obtained easily, their boys and their girls, instead of being necessitated to tend flocks, to labour hard in the fields, to churn, to wash, to dairy, would have time at their disposal for the cultivation of their minds and manners, for the expansion of their intellect, end quote. William Burgess, another York pastoralist, had quote, derived very, very great benefit indeed from the employment of Parkhurst lads, and freely admitted that from his experience of free boys and Parkhurst lads, I would take the latter in preference, as being more under control, they are far easier managed. Even though, he continued, the colony would derive a much greater benefit from the introduction of convicts on a large scale under the protective system usually adopted in penal settlements. And I'll end that there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy and Jane, for those terrific papers, bringing the connections between, or the relationship between slavery and indentured labour and Indigenous labour and new histories of capitalism together in that way, and also bringing a particularly Western Australia perspective, which is very illuminating. So thank you, great. We have plenty of time for questions. If people want to ask questions, you can put them in the chat or indicate, raise your hand, or perhaps put up a signal, and I hope that I can see it, or Carl can recognise who's got a question.
Look, I think it's probably best if people just unmute and speak up.
Okay.
It's only a problem if a whole bunch of people are trying at the same time, but I think we'll be okay.
Okay, all right.
Oh yeah, if somebody does have a question, go ahead. I was going to just add that one of the kind of methods the project is using is to track biographies from slave owning Britain out to the Australian colonies, taking as our starting point the Legacies of British Slavery database, which is hosted at the University College London. So that is very much about individuals and biographies and life journeys, and where possible tracking the money trail. You know, those who secured compensation funds are recorded in the LBS database, and then in some cases we can track them out to Australia. So Georgiana, for example, has done, well, we've all been doing this work, but Georgie in particular has done some fantastic work looking at figures like Governor James Sterling. So we haven't really talked about that today, but Jeremy, I was struck when you were sort of talking that by the fact that many of the individuals you name are sort of linked to the LBS. So there are some of those slavery links coming up in those rich York pastoralist debates as well. Peter Hobbin, I can see Peter Hobbins.
Thanks, Jeremy and Jane. I'm going to ask the narrative question, what happened next? I mean, 1849 is, of course, a major date around the Australian colonies, and the gravitational centre for labour obviously moved far to the east from the discovery of gold. So I just wondered whether you have any indicators that the processes you've outlined here and were in place by 1849 actually intensified those pressures to gather or to enslave unfree labour in the decades after the discovery of gold in the eastern colonies.
Just if I can jump in, my initial response to that is certainly the process for organising or agitating for transportation in Western Australia seems very localised, and I think the West is really isolated from the eastern colonies. Of course, there are labour flows and people do travel from Western Australia to the east. But whether or not the later kind of pressure for labour from gold is linked in any way to the push for transportation in Western Australia, I'm not sure. I think certainly the push from pastoralists, but also once it became clear that infrastructure development would proceed and would benefit from convict labour, there was a much more positive response to convict labour once convicts arrive in Perth or Fremantle in 1850. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of my first response.
I'd just like to make a couple of quick points. I think in Western Australia also what we see is the expansion of the frontier to the north, and there are figures there, even interestingly, some with direct links back to places like Demerara in the southern Caribbean, which were the kind of still expanding slave colonies. And they're either they themselves or the next generation are taking up huge tracts of land up north, and they're imposing these extremely brutal systems to support pastoralism and pearling as well. And I think so in fact, Malcolm Albrook has a paper coming out quite soon in the Australian Journal of Biography and History, where he looks explicitly at slavery in those industries. But at the same time that we see those slavery-like practices imposed on Aboriginal people up north in WA, we also see, as Amanda Nettlebeck has pointed out and others, the tightening of a regime of protection. In turn, you can sort of extend its antecedents, back to earlier slavery regimes. So we see, and protection incorporates techniques ultimately derived from the slave system, such as flogging, alongside disciplinary processes. But I would say that one of the major legacies that these processes have left us, particularly following the establishment of a white Australia from, as we now know, from the 1830s onwards, is a kind of global system of racialised border flows and labour flows, where people in some countries have the right to travel and have rights, and people from other countries have great difficulty travelling, and that what some people call migrant rights are extremely limited. And I would see that as a kind of global legacy of these sorts of processes.
Really good point. Oh yeah, there's a hand. I can see. Nicholas, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for such interesting presentations. I guess at the risk of sounding slightly parochial from Adelaide, my question was just about South Australia and what status it held in the history you were talking about, in particular, Jane, from that kind of evolution from slavery to other forms of disciplined labour, because here, I guess in particular, we have that enduring mythology of a place built by free labour, free of the convict and slave stains. So I guess I'm wondering what's the significance of South Australia, and why did it take off as a new kind of colony using Wakefield's ideas?
So South Australia is a fantastic example because, as you say, it was established on the basis of Wakefield's principles of systematic colonisation, even though they were never, it was controversial, they were never applied perfectly. He had, there were a number of, it was never imposed in that sort of ideal way. But also, and part of that kind of conjunction, I think, is that it was established in 1835. So this is when compensation funds are starting to flow to the former slave owners. And Alan Lester and Nikita Vanderbilt published a paper a couple of years ago in History Workshop Journal, where they sort of look explicitly at some of these links in South Australia. And yeah, I think that South Australia is a perfect example of these processes at this very moment. I also think there are a number of very interesting biographies that remain to be researched. And again, Beth Robertson has a paper coming out. We have a special issue of the Australian Journal of Biography and History coming out in the next month. And Beth Robertson's paper is a study of her own great-great-grandfather, who was the son of Archibald Sterling of Keir and an enslaved woman, and who took money, basically compensation money, and came out to Adelaide and then built his own family dynasty in Adelaide. So really interesting life journeys that map the flow of money and influence and these ideas about recreating what they left behind, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, now we have a question also from Frank, and I think Anthony O'Donnell has one in the chat. So I'm assuming you want to put that question, Anthony. So perhaps after we hear from Frank, we'll go to Anthony. Yeah.
Thanks, Diane. Thanks to both speakers for two terrific papers. I think mine's to Jane, but in fact, maybe Jeremy as well. And I just wonder if you might reflect on the historiographical context that you're operating in. Jane mentioned John Hirst's book on convict society, but I guess one of the things John did in that book was, in some ways, was to place a fair bit of daylight between slavery and convict labour in all sorts of ways. I mean, I think the book begins, doesn't it, almost by saying something like, you know, the seeds of freedom were there from the beginning. I just wondered, you know, have there been moments in the historiography where these connections have kind of come forward or sort of burst the kind of bounds perhaps of an existing historiography that perhaps was reluctant to acknowledge these kinds of connections. So I'm just sort of wondering, I mean, I guess the sort of stereotype would be that, you know, recognising the connections with slavery would undermine, you know, certain kinds of images that we have of Australia as a place sort of founded in freedom and enlightenment and all the rest of it. But I just wonder how the historiography actually stacks up when one looks at perhaps, you know, some of the work that's been done, you know, perhaps even going right back to the 19th century, but certainly, you know, the more recent historiography, perhaps after the Second World War.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that. So I alluded to that very briefly in passing, but of course, as I said, you know, this is a long-standing debate. And I think there are two different things really. So it's a little bit with not at cross purposes, but I think John Hirst, of course, was concerned to understand and identify the convict experience. And I would also make the point very briefly that when we talk about convicts and the convict regime, it was very diverse. So it varied tremendously over place and time. You know, this is a system that lasted for 80 years and in different, and even that varied actually. So, you know, I have been very careful actually. And in fact, in my book, which Diane mentioned, I have a chapter on each decade leading up to the 1820s. And I think it's a different picture in each of those. But the point about, you know, and I think most Australian historians from John Hirst onwards have said, no, very different, as you say, daylight between slavery and the convict experience. But I'm not really interested in the convict experience here, important and interesting as it is. For me, the question is, what is the system of labour that was being constructed and what is the intersection between, you know, Claire Anderson talks about a spectrum of labour forms and labour flows. In fact, a number of people have written about that in recent years. But what is the intersection between the anti-slavery movement and the campaign to end slavery in the Caribbean and these other kind of large-scale processes that are going on? And so if we look at that decade of, you know, Big and his Trinidad kind of immediately prior experience and his work there, it's very clear that he was imposing aspects of that system in New South Wales. And people like Tamsin O'Connor, for example, who has written about convicts, and now more recently Emma Christopher, have looked at the way that attempts to establish these tropical industries like sugar, in fact, drew in all sorts of ways from the Caribbean, whether that's in terms of individuals who had that experience in growing sugar. So I've forgotten his name, Williams. Oh, sorry, COVID brain, it's my excuse.
Yeah, Eric.
There are particular, sorry, somebody.
Frank said Eric Williams. Was it Eric Williams you were thinking of?
No, sorry. A formerly enslaved man, a black man who established sugar in at Port Macquarie. I think he was from Antigua, and he brought the knowledge of how to cultivate sugar But of course, his supervisors sort of took credit for that, as Emma has shown. And I also think that when going back to the earlier question that you asked, Peter, about the legacies of this sort of moment that we've been looking at, in Queensland, again, the sugar industry offers these really powerful examples, both in the kinds of industries that are being established and sugar, but also the techniques, and in many cases, the actual people who are kind of divesting from, or simply, expanding from their Caribbean holdings and coming to Australia. And again, that's a really interesting and complex history that's being explored. So I think you're sort of saying, your question, Frank, is about, have people actually argued that there were forms of slavery in the past? And I think there have been. I think Ray Evans in Queensland, for example, is an example of that. Is it Kay Schaefer? That fantastic labour history.
Kay Saunders.
Oh, Kay Saunders very explicitly drew that, mapped those links between Queensland and the plantation and between earlier forms of slavery. So I think that work, landmark research, made its mark, and it's kind of been forgotten, or it's sort of
yes, it has
fallen out.
Right.
Yeah.
And I suppose that there was also convict workers that kind of uses a concept of forced labour, doesn't it? The convict workers election in the late 80s. Would that be right? I think.
Yeah, I can see people nodding who might like to respond, actually. Lyndall might like to say something, but that book, I think it's very quantitative. And anyway, yeah, I might let Lyndall speak if she's interested.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to say, certainly in terms of looking at forced labour in Northern Australia, particularly in Queensland and the NT, and probably in the Kimberley as well, we do have new evidence emerging of Aboriginal people being kidnapped and forced into labour rarely with contracts signed, unless they were being kidnapped to work in the maritime industries like pearling and bêche de mer. And that attracted the interest of the imperial government. But we have got many cases now of Aboriginal people being kidnapped, taken to stations, given as presents to neighbouring pastoralists, and these people spending the rest of their lives on these stations. So I think your work, Jane, and is beginning to open up new ways of asking questions of some of the archival sources. So it's a very exciting moment, I think, in 19th century Australian history in terms of looking at labour, re-looking at labour practices in this way. And certainly, I think that although slavery has officially been abolished, it's very hard to give up the practices.
Thank you. Thanks, Lyndall.
Thanks, Lyndall. While you're still there, do you want to put your question, Lyndall, that I saw that you put in the I know
no, someone answered it very, very immediately answered the question for me. So that's great. That's great. I have it now. Thank you.
Julie Kimber's put in there, Google says James Williams. Jane. Does that sound right?
What is the question? Sorry.
No, that it was James, the name you were looking for.
Oh, I'm sorry, James Williams. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And actually, Emma's written about that recently, but others, and I think Tamsin O'Connor has actually, she wrote a really great paper that I came across, which I don't think she's published, which explores some of these links and questions, some of this historiography. She's
working on a paper for our special issues, so perhaps that will be it. So we did promise Anthony could ask his question. Are you still there, Anthony? Would you like to leap in at this point?
Yeah, look, no, I think the question, after I posted that, I think Jane addressed that with regard to the compo for slaves being seen as property, and then people taking that money to Australia and settling. And I just gave the example of George Angus, which was another example on top of what Jane answered with Nick's question. So I don't think I have much more to add. The only other thing I would add as a labour lawyer and labour historian is if we're talking about free and unfree labour on a continuum, you can almost take it further to what you might call normal contracts of employment in the 19th century under Masters and Servants Act, when they're backed by penal sanctions. Again, it's just another step along a continuum. And so Robert Steinfeld's stuff in the United States talking about the disjunction between free labour, unfree labour, slave labour. And again, Diane would be up on this, but it's a great Australian historiography going back to Adrian Merritt's work, Michael Quinlan's work, and others is really worth putting in it. Fascinating. Thank you, Jeremy and Jane, both great presentations.
Thank you so much. That's great.
Yeah.
And
thank you.
And Diane, I know that you've also been looking at this kind of legal background and the punitive kind of dimensions of the Master and Servants Act and so on, which, I mean, one of the interesting things I think is that after abolition, there were a range of measures imposed in the former slave colonies to ensure labour, including things like vagrancy acts and, you know, the notion of absconding from contracts. And I was struck quite recently where Pacifica workers in Queensland, like fruit pickers, were accused of absconding, and they're being prosecuted to this very day on that under that framework. It's quite astonishing.
Astonishing, isn't it? Yeah. I see that Jeremy, did you want to respond, or did you?
Yeah, just to add very quickly, it's really just following on from what a number of people have said. I think on the continuum of forced labour, the way in which both apprenticeship and indenture are used or misused in early Western Australia, I think sets up the scene for a lot of what Lyndall was talking about in the north. From very early on, both the Masters and Servants legislation, and as they apply to things like apprentices and indentured labour, means that masters have a lot of leeway. And I think, Lyndall, I think it's Penn Hetherington who writes a little bit about this, about how kidnapped workers are, retrospectively signed up for apprenticeships, and in that way are kind of given a kind of legal gloss, and then become under, Masters and Servants legislation. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Judith McVeigh has a question. Yeah. Perhaps you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, look, thanks. That was really interesting papers. Really, really, really appreciate all this. Talked a lot about the effect of discipline on the workers involved. I'm just wondering, I know that coming up to Federation in 1901, huge debates about the necessity to make Australia a wage labour area, and there was a lot of opposition to the slave labour in Queensland. There was these big debates that went on. I don't know a lot about it, but we haven't talked about how did they evaluate the cost of labour and whether, why the turn to wage labour eventually, because economists would argue that wage labour, well, Marxist economists would argue that wage labour is actually cheaper for the capitalists because the workers are forced to look after themselves based on, these small wages that were being handed out. So it actually ended up being cheaper for the bosses, employers and the slave owners. Is this true? Lyndall's shaking her head. But so I'm just wondering if anybody's got any light to shine on that kind of issue.
I mean, I can only speak for the early pastoral industry in Western Australia, and it just, the demand for labour far exceeds the supply of free labour. And so those who are able to, say, be shepherds or to shear demand such exorbitant wages that forced labour very soon becomes an attractive option, or some version of coercive labour, which is why I think Indigenous workers are so they're pursued by pastoralists in the 1830s and 1840s before, and also obviously the Parkers before convicts are. I don't know if that answered the question, but
I think also going back to those debates around the Abolition Act back in 1833, the question of free labour versus forced labour was, of course, central to those debates, and it became their sort of mantra, going back to Adam Smith, that the kind of this faith in the superiority of free labour. But of course, that then became bound up with capitalism, and it's that laissez-faire ideology. So it became a sort of moral. So it's bound up with the origins of capitalism in that other very interesting way. It became a kind of moral program that was well established within a decade. And yet, so, Seymour Drescher's classic book, it's called The Mighty Experiment. And it's a quotation from someone debating abolition in Parliament, because no one really knew what would happen. Will they lose all their money and no one will ever work and they'll all become ruined? They'll all be ruined or not. And anyway, so that's, I think those, there are echoes of those earlier debates, perhaps, in what you're referring to.
Do we have any other questions before we go? Speak now, leap in if you have a question. Okay. This has been absolutely fantastic discussion, and absolutely revisiting some familiar material in a whole new way that I think is very exciting, and opening up the field and giving us terrific way forward, I think, too. So thank you so much, both Jane and Jeremy, for sharing your work, and under such arduous conditions and circumstances. Jane, that's wonderful. And thank you all also for coming along and for your questions. We will have more seminars later in the year, pursuing these questions a little bit more with some other presentations that we will send out a notice about in due course. So thank you. I think we will end it there, and hope we see you all next time.